Hello and welcome back to Orthodoxy 101. This is our third segment in our series of marriage and sexuality. Segment 3, we're going to be discussing homosexuality and gay marriage. Father, thank you again for being with us. This is a heavy topic, but let's get started. Okay, starting with our first question. Father, we look around at society and we see marriage being redefined, not just as being a contract, but also redefined as being between whatever two people love each other, whether it be a man and a man or a woman and a woman. Why is that definition of marriage not acceptable in the Orthodox Church?
Well, it is not acceptable because of what we've discussed before.
Right.
That marriage is something between a man and a woman, according to God's creation.
Right.
Jesus Christ discusses this in the gospel. He says, have you never read that in the beginning God created them male and female? And for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. What God has joined together, let man not separate. And so there is this idea, this concept, an icon of union between a man and a woman that takes place in marriage as an icon of the relationship that God has with his people and his people have with him. And also in marriage, there is the natural production of children, which is impossible within a homosexual relationship, aside from the medical and reproductive technologies that we have today. Very simply, naturally, children are impossible in a homosexual relationship.
Right.
So as an icon of God and God's relationship to his people, marriage is only defined as that between a man and a woman.
Thank you. On to our second question. Homosexuality is being normalized by claiming it is something natural so that the gay community can be afforded natural rights as referred to in the political community. How does that relate to the Orthodox understanding of issues pertaining to homosexuality?
Yes, and we've sort of discussed the whole idea of nature or what is natural in the previous segment.
Right.
The Apostle Paul, in the first chapter to the Romans, discusses how sexual relationships between men and women, something that is unnatural. And there is evidence for this, natural evidence for this. For instance, if you go on government websites and you look up HIV infection, for instance, it says that 4% of the male population in our country, for instance, are men having sex with men, but that 4% accounts for 78% of new HIV infections. What does that mean? Essentially, that means that this is a very unhealthy lifestyle. Or likewise, you can look at other studies where the average life expectancy of a gay man is 8 to 20 years fewer than that of a non-gay man. Once again, some people may see that as anecdotal evidence, but it is evidence that it is a very unhealthy lifestyle, any way you cut it.
Right.
We have certain natural and blameless urges and desires.
Right.
Those are to be exercised in a godly way. If a man has a desire for another man, that may be a pure desire.
Okay.
But it also may be twisted and used in an impure way. And that is what we would say is an unnatural way of homosexuality. Likewise, women for women.
Okay.
And it is unfortunate that love has been equated with sexual experience to a great degree in our society. And that sexual experience and that experience of pleasure with another person has been made synonymous with what it means to love someone. But very clearly that is not the definition of love, the base definition of love or the highest definition that we have in the church.
Okay.
And so for that reason, that's how the church approaches these things.
All right. On to our third question. What is the understanding of sexual orientation? To elaborate, how does it relate to love in an Orthodox sense when two people of the same gender have a love for each other? Is that homosexuality or is that condemned by the church?
Sexual orientation, of course, is the kind of the redefinition of these gay issues in our society today.
Mm-hmm.
Sexual orientation has to do with your attraction for another person in a sexual way, and in order to fulfill certain sexual desires or affections.
Okay.
The church does not see affection for another person, even if it is another person of the same gender, to be necessarily sinful. It depends on how you express that, how you act on that.
Okay.
So orientation or desire is not equated with homosexuality or condemned in the Orthodox Church.
Okay.
So there are many examples of saints, both in the Bible and in the history of the church, who were the same gender, who lived together, who were completely devoted to one another, who loved one another, but they were not homosexual. They did not express this love as a sexual thing and merely a relationship of convenience or pleasure. One great example is King David and his friend Jonathan in the Old Testament. And after the death of Jonathan, David says, your love for me was something to be greatly admired and surpassing the love of women. That's what David says of Jonathan and Jonathan's love for David. Likewise, we have the apostles Peter and Paul, who are depicted in a famous icon that we have in the church where they're hugging one another. And their heads actually form a heart, if you look at it, to show that this is an example of pure love and affection between two people of the same gender. Christ says that we need to love one another as he has loved us. And greater love is no man than he lay down his life for his friend. And so if you have affection for another person of the same gender, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It depends on how that suggestion then is acted upon and where you take that, what direction it goes. It can either be a healthy direction or it can be an unhealthy one.
So I guess that could also be applied to heterosexual couples.
Absolutely.
The feeling is, the emotion of love is natural. It's
Many people assume that
action that is dangerous.
Many people assume that, hey, if you're heterosexual and you're having sex with, a woman and you're a man, or with a man if you're a woman, that's by definition okay because it's heterosexual.
Right.
But that's not necessarily true either, as we've discussed previously in the last segment. Promiscuity, infidelity, fornication, all of these things outside of marriage likewise are equally as unhealthy.
So it kind of encompasses everything.
It does.
Okay. All right. Last but not least, Father, this is our final question. Oftentimes, those who are opposed to homosexuality or the gay community are labeled by the gay community as being hateful and judgmental. This is not the case with the exception of groups such as Westboro Baptist Church. How can we show the love of Christ while standing firm in denouncing what God has revealed in the church to be sinful?
Yes, very excellent question. The church does not presume to judge by appearances. The church is here to give the love of God to every human being for the purposes of salvation and communion with God. The disruption of that communion is what we call sin. The darkening of our spiritual faculties and powers, which leads to all kinds of unhealthy things in our world today. This is specifically the Apostle Paul's point in Romans chapter 1, that people have exchanged the worship of the true God for the worship of creation. And then he begins to list, various sins, and the first thing he mentions is the unnatural activity and attraction that people have for persons of the same gender. The love of God also points out what is unhealthy for us. There is no greater hate, I would say, than if you see someone doing something that is destructive and you never tell them that it's destructive. Think about parents and their children.
Right.
Is it hateful for a parent to tell their child, you better stop that? or you're going to get hurt, or that's going to lead to something very, very destructive later in your life. No, that's a sign of love. And this is ultimately what God does for all of his children. You know, he points out our faults, but then he gives us the grace and the forgiveness in order to begin to live the opposite. And that's what we want to do. We want to purify our desires. We want to purify and transform our life so that it is in the right direction and in a healthy direction in communion with God. And so when the church stands its ground and is very firm about this whole issue of, you know, being gay or not gay or homosexuality and what that constitutes, that's the reason that we're doing this. It's not to hate anybody, it's to love someone and hopefully to show them a better way.
Excellent. Well, Father, thank you very much. This was a very heavy segment, I think, for this series. So thank you very much for your time, for your answers, and we will see you next week. And thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Take care.